the most powerful man in England sits trapped inside his own body. His legs, rotting, ulcered, leaking blood. The air around him so foul that courtiers cover their faces to breathe. And still, he eats. This is not a tale of war or betrayal. It's the story of how one king's appetite devoured his throne, his kingdom, and finally, himself. The grotesque downfall of Henry VIII, a man who ate himself to death. The rise of a glutton picture. This, a wooden chair creaks beneath the weight of a king. England's once mighty monarch, Henry VIII, now sits trapped in a fortress of his own flesh. His legs, once the pride of tournaments and battlefields, have rotted into ulcered stumps that leak blood and pus. The stench is unbearable. Courtiers cover their faces with perfumed cloths just to stand near him. But this isn't where the story begins. To understand the monster, we must remember the man. In 1509, the 18-year-old Henry ascended the throne. He was the very picture of the Renaissance ideal, 6'2", broad-shouldered, athletic, and brilliant. He could joust all afternoon, dance through the night, and hunt until dawn. The people saw in him a new golden age, a prince of vitality and charm. Yet even then, beneath the polished surface, something darker stirred. Henry didn't simply eat for pleasure, he devoured. His relationship with food was never one of hunger and satisfaction. It was one of power, ritual, and control. Inside the vast kitchens of Hampton Court, over 200 cooks and servants labored night and day. The 6 roaring hearths consumed 8 tons of oak daily to feed one man. Henry's appetite had already outgrown moderation. Every meal was a campaign, every dish an act of conquest. The royal kitchens butchered thousands of animals each year: sheep, oxen, deer, pigs, calves, even swans and peacocks. And much of it never left the king's table. Banquets became performances. Trumpets sounded as whole roasted peacocks were carried in, feathers still attached, gleaming with gold leaf. Henry sat enthroned at the head of a table longer than a ship's deck, eyeing the platters like a general surveying enemy ranks. He would eat an entire bird as an appetizer, move on to a swan stuffed with smaller birds, and then to mountains of beef that could have fed a family for weeks. Food was not nourishment. It was theater. It was dominance. What began as indulgence soon turned into obsession. And as his power expanded, so did his waistline. Feast and fear, the poisoned table. As Henry's appetite grew, so did his fear. Power, after all, breeds paranoia, and for Henry, every meal became a battlefield. He was convinced that his enemies plotted to poison him. No dish could be trusted. No servant could be believed. The act of eating turned into a ritual of dread. Each plate was first carried to a locked chamber, where trusted tasters sampled every bite under the watchful eyes of guards. The food was sealed in containers, tested with alchemical powders said to expose toxins. Servants were searched before and after every delivery. And when the king finally lifted a fork, the entire court watched in silence, waiting to see if the most powerful man in England would live or die. This constant terror only deepened his obsession. The kitchen became an armed fortress, and the act of dining a kind of royal exorcism, purging fear with meat and wine. Yet the king's hunger was no longer about food. It was about control. He devoured to prove his dominance, to remind himself that he still ruled, that death hadn't yet taken the throne. When a servant delayed a dish, Henry's fury was instant and lethal. He had men executed for serving cold meat, for seasoning that displeased him, even for stealing scraps from his table. Those closest to him began to notice the transformation. The athletic prince was vanishing. In his place rose something monstrous, a man who treated gluttony as divine right. At feasts that lasted hours, even days, Henry would eat until his voice grew hoarse and his breathing labored. Diplomats and ambassadors sat horrified as the King of England negotiated war and peace between mouthfuls of dripping beef, his fingers slick with grease, his lips stained with wine. Ambassadors wrote home describing a sight that bordered on madness, a ruler who tore into his food like an animal, chewing loudly, gasping for air, and laughing between bites. To Henry, these feasts were not moments of pleasure. They were declarations of power. Each bite was proof that he could consume anything, anyone, even his own limits. But his body disagreed. By his mid-30s, Henry's once proud form had begun to revolt. The legs that had danced and ridden into battle were now swollen and aching. His fine doublets had to be loosened by inches each month. Yet instead of restraint, the king demanded more. Larger furniture, wider doors, stronger horses. He saw his expanding size as proof of majesty, not decay. The more he grew, the more untouchable he felt. But beneath the silks and jewels, disease had begun its quiet work. What his physicians called a royal constitution was, in truth, the early onset of diabetes and heart failure. His thirst was endless, his hunger uncontrollable. He drank gallons of ale and wine each day and still demanded more food to silence the pain that no physician could cure. His body had become a furnace of indulgence, one that was burning itself alive from within. The body of a king, the prison of a man. By his 40s, Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince of legend. He was a prisoner inside his own body. The once strong legs that had carried him across tournament fields were now ulcerated, oozing wounds that refused to heal. The smell of rot clung to him wherever he went. Servants collapsed while dressing his sores. Courtiers requested transfers to escape the stench. The royal doctors tried everything. Leeches, cauterization, surgery. Nothing worked. Infection spread faster than they could cut. And through it all, Henry continued to eat. Each morning began with a grotesque ritual, a feast that could have fed an entire village. Whole roasted fowl, slabs of beef, meat pies, loaves of bread, and tankards of ale. Hours later came a second breakfast, then a luncheon, then another meal before dusk. His appetite no longer had rhythm or reason. It was simply continuous consumption. The kitchens of Hampton Court had become a vision of hell. Cooks fainted in the heat. The air was thick with fat and smoke. Floors slick with blood. Men were replaced mid-shift without ceremony when they collapsed. All of this labor existed for one man's hunger. Feeding the king became an engineering problem. He was too large to move unaided. So carpenters built reinforced chairs with hidden wheels. Teams of servants pushed him from chamber to chamber, the wheels creaking under his immense bulk. Ropes and pulleys were installed in his bedroom to hoist him out of bed. Doorways were widened, staircases replaced with ramps. Henry was now surrounded by mechanisms designed not for a monarch's majesty, but for his survival. At audiences, he could barely speak without wheezing. His once commanding voice had become a strained gasp. His neck disappeared into folds of flesh. Foreign envoys described him as a mountain that breathes. But even this ruin of a man clung to ceremony. Meals were still delivered with trumpets. Dishes still arranged with mathematical precision. Every feast remained a performance of power, though its audience now stared in revulsion instead of awe. What disturbed witnesses most wasn't his size, but his fury. Hunger drove his moods like a storm. If food was late, executions followed. If he was full, he laughed manically, only to collapse into brooding silence minutes later. His gluttony had become both his drug and his punishment. By this point, physicians knew the truth. They were watching their king eat himself to death. But none dared say it. One doctor who suggested lighter meals vanished from court. Another was executed. Henry called moderation treason. And so the feasts continued. The ulcers deepened, revealing bone. Servants gagged from the smell when they changed his bandages. Yet the king demanded more wine, more meat, more proof that he still ruled over something. Even if that something was only his table, his appetite had become the final symbol of his authority. And, like his power, it was consuming everything around him, his servants, his treasury, and his kingdom itself. Before we go further into Henry's decay, pause for a moment. If you want more stories where power, vanity, and death intertwine, subscribe to my channel. Every watch, every comment, keeps forgotten history alive. Now, back to the feast. The kingdom that fed. His hunger feeding. Henry VIII was no longer a royal duty. It was a national burden. By the 1540s, the cost of sustaining his appetite had reached catastrophic levels. The palace kitchens consumed nearly a quarter of England's yearly revenue. Forests were stripped bare to fuel the ceaseless hearths. Livestock vanished from farms to fill his tables. The poor starved while the king gorged. Chroniclers of the time called it a divine irony. One man devouring a kingdom. Henry's dining halls had become grotesque parodies of grandeur. He no longer dined with courtiers, but before them, like an exhibit. Feasts were spectacles of decay, the heavy breathing, the wet sounds of chewing, wine spilling down his chest, the odor of infection mixing with the scent of roasted meat. Ambassadors wrote home in disbelief. The Venetian envoy reported that the king ate enough for 3 men. The French ambassador said his banquets bordered on insanity. Those present described pale faces and a hall filled with the sounds of gluttony, the gasps, the slurps, the growls. But within those spectacles lay something more frightening than disgust. There was pity. For the mighty king had become a man enslaved to appetite, trapped in a loop of hunger and horror. Physicians stood helpless. They dressed his wounds in honey and wine. They prayed the infection would slow. It didn't. His legs turned black. The smell of gangrene filled the palace corridors. Still, Henry demanded food. Even his marriages withered beneath the weight of his addiction. Anne of Cleves fainted upon seeing him, expecting a gallant prince, finding a swollen ruin instead. Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, wept through their wedding feast as the king devoured course after course, meat dripping from his fingers. The women of his court saw in Henry not majesty, but mortality. Yet his pride endured. He believed his appetite a symbol of divine strength. To eat was to live. To live was to rule. Each morning, he dictated menus like a general planning battle. Swans, pheasants, calves, puddings, pies, endless lists of conquest through consumption. The lists survive today in royal archives written in his own hand. But the victory was hollow. Every bite carved away what remained of him. Sleep escaped him. Lying flat became deadly. He would snore himself awake, choking, gasping, demanding more wine to calm his nerves. Servants would find him asleep at the table, face buried in half-eaten food. By the mid-1540s, Henry's reign existed to serve his stomach. England's power had peaked, but its king was collapsing. The empire mirrored the man, bloated, rich, unstable, and rotting from within. And as his body decayed, so too did his mind. Henry began hiding food beneath his bed, convinced enemies would steal from him. Guards were ordered to kill anyone who touched his leftovers. He counted his platters each night. If a dish was missing, someone died. Fear ruled the court as much as hunger ruled the king. No rebellion, no enemy army had ever brought Henry to his knees, but his own appetite had succeeded where all others failed. It was devouring him alive. The death feast and the legacy of decay. By the winter of 1547, Henry VIII was no longer a king in command of anything. Not his court, not his mind, not even his own body. The monarch who had once bent nations to his will now needed ropes and servants to lift him from bed. His chambers reeked of infection. His breath rasped in short, wet gasps. His legs leaked pus that stained the marble floors of Hampton Court. And still, he ate. Feasting had become a round-the-clock operation. Records show deliveries to his rooms at every hour. Roasted birds for breakfast, meat pies for mid-morning, and full spreads of beef, bread, and wine before dusk. Specially built chairs held his enormous frame upright, while servants fed him like a machine that never stopped. Each bite was an act of defiance, a denial of death. If he could eat, he could rule. If he could feast, he could still pretend to be the godlike figure his portraits promised. His doctors watched helplessly. His heart was swollen, his liver failing, his lungs compressed beneath his weight. To question his diet meant death. One physician who dared suggest lighter meals was executed. Henry declared moderation treason. The palace that had once glowed with life now smelled of decay. Servants found rotting food hidden beneath his bed, meat stored like treasure, bread tucked into drawers. Guards stood watch over his leftovers. Henry counted his platters nightly. Convinced thieves or traitors would steal from him, he began to hallucinate feasts that didn't exist, describing banquets in vivid detail and raging when they failed to appear. Those forced to attend him spoke of a room filled with gasping, chewing, and groaning, the sounds of a man devouring himself alive. By January 1547, his body had begun to fail completely. Gangrene reached his bones, his pulse faltered, his breathing was shallow and ragged. And even as his mind slipped into delirium, his last coherent words were a request for roasted meat. That hunger was the final thing left of him. When he finally died, it was not peaceful. It was slow, heavy, and foul. The servants dared not move for hours. The silence was broken only by the drip of his ulcers onto the floor. It took 8 men to lift his coffin, reinforced so it wouldn't split under his weight. But during the funeral procession, the coffin swelled with gas and burst open. Fluids spilled across the church floor. Witnesses fled in horror. To those who saw it, it was divine justice. The body of a man who had worshipped flesh, now rebelling against him. A secret autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew. His heart was twice its normal size, thick with fat. His liver was spotted and hardened. His stomach stretched beyond human measure, still holding the remains of his final meal: roasted birds, beef, bread, and wine. His legs were eaten through with infection. He had not been poisoned. He had poisoned himself. After his burial, silence ruled. His physicians were forbidden to speak. The autopsy records were sealed. Painters were ordered to depict him not as he died, but as he had once been: strong, armored, magnificent. The truth was locked away with the corpse, but rumors spread. Word of the bursting coffin traveled across Europe. Ambassadors described the sight as divine punishment, a king so gluttonous that even the grave rejected him. In London, preachers warned that his fate was a message from God. When man worships his appetite becomes his God. And indeed, Henry's body became a mirror for his kingdom. The same excess that swelled his frame had swollen England, rich, powerful, and decaying from within. He tore the nation from Rome not for faith, but for control, for possession, for the freedom to consume without limit. His empire, like his body, grew vast and unstable, magnificent and doomed. After his death, the Tudor line inherited both his power and his curse. Mary carried his frailty and his obsession with divine judgment. Elizabeth carried his brilliance, his hunger for adoration, his fear of mortality. The shadow of Henry's appetite never left England. To history, he remains a paradox, builder of a nation, destroyer of himself. The man who imagined himself immortal, yet proved that no throne can protect the flesh from decay. His story endures not as triumph, but as warning. That power without restraint becomes gluttony, and gluttony becomes death. In the end, Henry VIII was not undone by rebellion or betrayal or war. He was undone by the simplest of human weaknesses, his own hunger. The feast ended, but the hunger outlived the man. Centuries have passed, yet his hunger still echoes. History remembers his empire, but it's his appetite that speaks louder. If this story unsettled you, there are others waiting. Kings, queens, saints, all rotting behind their legends. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to the channel so the next descent into history's darker corners finds you first.